Okay, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. Today's lecture is titled Made in God's Image, the Evidence. This is my third lecture in a series which is based on the first opening line of the Creed, where I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible. That's the bit that I'm concerned about. You will recall in the Gospel where Jesus had a coin in his hand and he said, whose image is this? And the answer was Caesar's. And Jesus responded and said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Now we fast forward 2,000 years, and in the 21st century, this coin has resurfaced. It's currently used predominantly by youth in the age group, typically between 15 and 25 years of age. The image, however, has changed. Instead of having Caesar's face on the coin, we have Caesar's message. And that message by Caesar on this coin is, God does not exist. Why? Because there is no evidence. That's what the coin says. And the people deal with that coin a lot, despite us living in a credit card era. And so we, in this lecture, will be looking at and discussing the evidence for God's existence. This talk is actually a direct extension of the one that I gave 2 weeks ago, where we covered a lot of territory. I won't go over that again, except at the tail end of that talk, I showed a series of pictures, diagrams, which showed the relationship between God, mankind, and the animal kingdom. And so that diagram there, the first one that we see, that's one of those pictures that we discussed last time. So we are now continuing from there. That diagram shows the relationship between God, Adam and Eve, or humanity, mankind, animal kingdom. And animal kingdom here, in fact, refers to the entire universe. We read in Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3, where it says, God finished making heaven and earth for man's sake. Here, heaven refers to the universe as distinct from the heaven that we relate to angels, two different realms. So the entire universe, it belongs to mankind. Man is the man, meaning man, woman. We are the rulers of the entire universe. Okay, so we'll now discuss that. Concerning this pictorial representation, where we show God at the top, Adam and Eve, humanity, and the universe there, that is theologically correct. The problem is that it's an easy target for atheists. They would dismiss this approach, saying that's all very well, but in reality it's theological speculation. And doing what they always do, they equate that theological speculation with faith, that famous word faith, which is so abused. And that means if you're talking about faith, there is by definition no evidence. At least that's the version that they relate to. And so that message comes across to the younger generation, the late teenagers, early adulthood. And I would actually like to ask our clergy, our priests, this very question. If one of your parishioners came to you and said the same thing to you, saying, Father, listen, I understand that, but there is no evidence. So that causes me conflict, because I learn at university that we rely in this life on evidence, and there is none. So It's a real issue here. So when the parishioner asks a priest this question, how does a priest respond? How would you respond? Would you simply say that this is what the Bible speaks about? But that's the whole problem. When youth are struggling with the Bible, with the church itself, with theology itself, they're very, very prone to believe the alternative version, the evidence version. And so that approach is not good enough. And this is what we'll be looking into sort of briefly today. And this, incidentally, that is not a hypothetical situation. Youth indeed, Orthodox youth, right now are succumbing to that mantra. That's happening now. Okay, so in this talk, we will see that there is indeed scientific evidence which supports this theological model. We will discuss that. And in the previous lecture, I went to quite a bit of considerable length to emphasise that Jesus, when he was on earth, he went out of his way to demonstrate that the laws of nature obey him. And he did this over and over again. And only after he convinced the people who witnessed his manipulation of laws of nature, only then did he ask people whether they had faith in his ability to heal them or to do other miracles. So we sort of focused on laws of nature. Now, what are laws of nature? I've shown one here in the middle. I read recently one of the scientists saying that when he writes his books, every time he includes one formula in the book, he loses half of his audience. Well, let me tell you, this is an easy one, so don't run away. I'll explain what it is. That is what's called Newton's law of gravity. And so that very law tells us why and how the moon orbits the Earth, and the Earth, how it orbits the sun and so on, and the galaxies, how they rotate. It's through that law that everything is held together. If that law didn't exist, we would not exist. There would be no theologians, there would be no audience, there would be nobody, nothing. So very quickly, F is the force of attraction between two bodies. M is the mass of the Earth in this case. Little m is the mass of the moon. You multiply those two masses together and you divide that by the distance that separates them twice squared. R is the distance between the centre of the Earth and the centre of the moon, and you square that, and you get the force. G is simply called gravitational constant. We won't discuss that. It's another big deal that we may in fact talk about later on in future series. Extremely important, but essentially that describes how the universe works. The universe obeys that law. And there are other laws, of course, lots of laws, but that's a fundamental one that you can understand and relate to. And incidentally, when NASA sends rockets to Mars or wherever, that's what they use, that law. So, and what am I getting at? I'll ask the question, who wrote that? Who wrote that? It's called Newton's law of gravity, but Newton did not write that law. Jesus wrote that law. Newton simply discovered that and decoded that law and wrote it down as a mathematical formula. So, in reality, there are two books. The one that we're conversant with is the book of Scripture, the Bible, fundamentally. But prior to that, Jesus wrote a book called The Laws of Nature. And those laws tell nature how to live, how to behave for the whole universe, how it exists. Those laws are written by God himself. And so when we understand that, then we can understand how mathematics, or mathematical definitions of laws of nature, how they are indeed theology. God wrote that. That's how theological it is. I can't make it any clearer than that. Okay, so that's enough. Presumably everybody knows what an electron is, but as we get older we tend to forget. And so here's a very simple model. This is the simplest atom that you can get anywhere in the universe. It's the hydrogen atom. In the centre is one particle called a proton. And that proton, as you can see, is orbited by one electron. Electron's got a negative charge, proton positive charge. The more complex atoms have more protons, and in fact things called neutrons, and that they all stuck together in the centre to form the nucleus, and you then have more electrons. So that's the standard configuration, but electrons can also travel by themselves in a straight line. They can go down optic cable, they can fly through space individually. So this is the point. Picture an electron freely floating through space. That electron spins about an axis. When physicists or cosmologists talk about spin, they visualize that axis as being vertical. So the electron spins one way or another way about this vertical axis. The first diagram there is called spin down, meaning that the axis is pointing down. You can see an arrowhead at the bottom. And when the electron spins in the clockwise direction, the axis is pointing down. It's not too hard to understand, just follow me, it's important. So the electron is travelling through space, and at one moment its axis is pointing down and it's spinning clockwise. Then what happens is, instantly, at random, the axis flips, and so you have what's called spin up. And so it's gone from spinning in one direction, it instantly flips this way, and it's spinning in the opposite direction. And I'll demonstrate this later with a little model that I've made. And the point is that there's no logic or sense. This is done at random. And it could be that flipping and flopping like this happening. It could be very, very quick. It could be milliseconds. It could be seconds. It could be any amount of time. And there's no law that we're aware of that determines this flipping process. So the electron's flying through space and it's going to flip, 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 flip. And so when the first picture is spin down, spin up. This picture, the third picture there, is the actual atom by itself going through space, and it's doing its flipping action. So it appears to be going in both directions. So one fraction of a second it's spin up, then it's down, then it's up, then it's down, it's up and down. And that's what it's doing. And so because it's doing that, the electron doesn't actually have a physical existence as we know it. It's like a ghost particle. If it was conscious, it would not know itself what is happening to it. It's all random. I've made a little model. This is my electron. It's a super electron. Hang on, I'll do it this way. You can see it's pointing up. And I'll be turning this spindle in one direction this way. And you can see that it's going counterclockwise. Okay? Now I'll be flipping this, still turning it the same way, and you can see now the arrows are going the opposite direction, so the spin has changed. It went from anti-clockwise to clockwise. So the electron spin itself changes. It's not just the axis. The axis is linked to this, but it's the definition. Down spin, up spin, or spin up, spin down, but the electron physically does the rotating change. That's the point that I wanted to make. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. Subatomic particles, an electron is a subatomic particle, but there are other ones. We're sticking with electrons. When, in this diagram here, you can see I'm referring to two people, Alice and Bob. Why? Because that's what physicists do when they write about two theoretical people. In this case, there are two electrons involved. Those two electrons originated from the same source. As they came into existence, they already started spinning and they went in opposite directions. And they kept flying and flying opposite directions, doing their flip-flop. Okay, so now Alice happens to live in Brunswick here, Melbourne. Bob lives in Sydney. Well, what's that, 1,000 kilometres or something away? Yeah, about 1,000 kilometres there. All right. Now, the two electrons started their life together. They are related as if they were one. The only difference being that they behave in opposite directions. That is, when Alice's electron, the one that's coming towards her, is upspin, Bob's electron is downspin. When Alice's electron decides to do a flip that way, Bob's does that. So they are in unison all the time, but at random. So no one knows what's going on. And so then, this is the big deal. The electron approaches Alice's laboratory, and Alice has a container which captures this electron. And so it's stuck there. It's probably held together by magnetic fields or something. Meanwhile, Bob's electron, 1,000 kilometres away, also enters a box that captures that electron. When that electron is in both boxes, two boxes, separated, they're still doing their act together, but in opposite flips. When Alice then looks at her box and sees the electron, that electron then becomes permanently fixed in either upspin or downspin. It no longer flips. And so her observation as a human being has caused that electron to now become real. It now is no longer flipping. It's forever real with upspin in this case. Then she picks up the phone, rings Bob, and says, "Hey, Bob, have a look in your box and I'll tell you what's happening." So Bob opens his box and she tells him before he opens, "You will find that your electron has become real as well and it's got downspin." Do you understand? So this scenario, two separate electrons going that way. So it's either spinning up, down, or that, and they're going along their way. She has a peek at her electron. That stops flipping. It becomes a real electron with an axis pointing up. Doing that caused this electron to instantly become real and point down. And that distance can be, in fact, so far apart, it's at the opposite ends of the galaxy. One's at one end of the Milky Way, 100,000 light years further down the track is the other one. The same thing happens. This is an instantaneous thing. And so what I'm saying here is that the laws of nature, this is a clear example, laws of nature obey humanity. Mankind, by observing nature, determines how nature behaves. It gives nature reality. So in that context, we are co-creators of the universe. So that earlier theological model, which showed God at the top, mankind in the middle, and the universe below, that the universe was subservient to humanity, this is a clear example of the universe, in fact, behaving based on what mankind chooses to do, to look or not to look.